Welcome to Forum 360 on Fusion, your PBS channel and your Rubber City radio stations. We are co-sponsored by the Jewish Community Center. This is Leslie Ungar, your host today. We welcome a very special guest today, a four-legged guest anchor, along with our two-legged guests, Belfance and Wendy Crann. We have a special topic today. For dog lovers out there, you may have heard the saying, dog is man's best friend. And many of us, like me, believe it. But what if a dog is more than the family pet, a partner, a lifeline, a service animal charged with improving a quality of life? Today we have the pleasure of hearing a story with several incredible twists and turns that we can all benefit from hearing. At the center of this story are kids, dogs, furry service animals, and adults in different and unusual places that make a huge difference in the lives of families. This story revolves around W.A.G.S for kids, working animals giving service for kids. These service animals can open doors, they can bring a disabled child, their wheelchair, their shoes, or just play catch, allowing them a few minutes to be normal kids. To Anchor and to Eve and to Wendy, I welcome you and thank you so much for coming today to tell us your stories.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.
And a very special welcome to you, young man. Wendy, you asked that I referred to these dogs as service animals. Can you tell us from your perspective, what is the difference between a dog and a service animal?
Well, the conflict really comes from the discussion of what's a service animal and what's a therapy dog. And those are the terms that get a little muddled in terms of people's perception and in terms of what accessibility requires for dogs to be out in public places. So talking about a pet or a therapy dog would be a dog that's well trained. Therapy dogs in particular have to go through certain amounts of training to have them be obedient to their owner out in public places and to accept the interaction with strangers calmly and efficiently. And so I'd bring my therapy dog to a hospital and have someone pet it and say, don't you feel better? And now I'm going home with my dog who happens to do therapy work. A service animal is placed in a partnership with a particular person who is protected by the Americans with Disabilities Act. And service dogs are trained to a proficiency of task assignment. They have to do something. They can't just be there to be, a
cute
comfort.
and cuddly.
To be cute and cuddly.
Yes.
That's exactly right. And so task assignment is the difference that makes a service dog. And based on that, they have rights of access with persons with disabilities that are protected by our laws. And that's what we train, service dogs.
So you train, and they have to be task-oriented. But Eve, tell us from a mom perspective. We see a service animal, fetching a ball or socks. But as a mom, can you share with us how the tasks that Wendy has told us these dogs learn, these service animals learn, how do they make the life of someone like your son William or your family better?
Well, I think that some of the tasks are very personal to a child such as William. For example, when William is on the floor stretching, there is a command called cuddle, and his ears might perk up right now. There you go, anchored down. But as William is stretching, which is not fun for him, it's painful, in fact, for him. He has his dog by his side, literally making him feel better and helping him through that. And so that's just one of many examples I can give you as to how it
your
enhances.
dog needed to learn different tasks than a dog that was placed in another family.
Yes, and I know Wendy can speak to that process a lot better than I can, because it takes at least, for most animals, I believe 2 years. But there are many commands and many tasks that the dog, for example, he knows how to get up on William's wheelchair. And because William isn't on the floor all the time, there is a command, I will spell it, L-O-V-E, and he knows that he is to place his head on William's lap. and come to him and stay there in a particular way. So there are a lot of activities and commands like that are very, I think, connect William to his dog, and certainly give him companionship and a connection that is unlike any certainly he's ever had.
Now, you were not a dog family prior to your newest
No.
addition.
No.
So
We forgave her for that.
Really? You're just lucky.
That was a quick study.
But for your son, now, since he wasn't used to being around animals, or what some might consider a bigger dog,
Right.
did he have to get over any fear? Did he have to learn about how he interacts with the dog, as well as the dog learning how to interact with a human?
That's a great question, but no, he was fearless. He had absolutely no reservations whatsoever. So that was a very easy transition for him. He took to Anchor immediately, and whenever anybody says the name Anchor, you get the biggest smile on his face. And they became pretty comfortable with each other fairly quickly. Anchor sleeps in William's room. He has his little kennel there, and they have a little routine. When William's getting ready for bed, he plops on the bed with him. He knows it's time to get ready, and then eventually he goes into his kennel and they settle down for the night. And so usually my last good night is, "Good night, boys. Go to sleep," and that always gets a chuckle out of William.
Now, over the years on Farm 360, we have had dogs that help returning service people with their challenges. We've had police dogs that help autistic kids. We had a dog de Bordeaux that was just good at being big and looking big. But we've never had dogs trained by prisoners. So first, I have to ask you, Wendy, tell us about how prisoners training dogs came about.
It came about because we were a tiny little local charity, poor as church mice, and I had no place to put dogs.
But truly, I don't think that everyone says, "I have no place to put dogs," and comes up with the idea of prisoners.
Well, I had seen a television show, and I can't even remember, I think it was someplace in Texas, was 10, 11, almost 12 years ago now, excuse me, that I saw this television show, and I thought, what a great thing. A place where...
How do you go from the concept to actually making it happen?
I am sort of relentless in my pursuit of doing this, and I always have been, particularly where it comes to meeting the needs of children, which was a completely untouched area of service work being done for dogs. In fact, children were being excluded from applying for service dogs because it's a very different thing to train dogs for a child.
Now, I have to ask you, did you just have a belief it would work? I use horses to teach people about their leadership skills, and I never saw it. I just had a belief that these two worlds could come together.
Sure.
You just had a belief
Well,
that
I
the
knew-
idea of the service dogs and kids that would come together?
I absolutely knew it for a fact because I am a child that grew up in a household with dogs. And I remember vividly my experiences with dogs from when I was a little tiny girl. And I remember how it made me feel. I remember how it made me view the world. I remember how I saw it through kindness and how you treated living beings. And I clearly believed, and still do, that the connection between dogs and children exists, whether you think so or you think so or I think so. It is.
So how did you just pick a prison and go to it?
Well, I didn't just pick a prison. I did a little research. The problem with the research was that of the 32 prison institutions in Ohio, most of them already had dog programs, and most of them were sort of rescue villages, sort of overflow from rescue facilities around the state. And very few were being applied to teaching inmates, anyone really, how to train a dog. It was more a temporary living situation. I was very lucky to meet someone who, through their experiences as a social worker, had a contact at a prison who, I think life carries you where you're supposed to go, and I made a good contact.
So let us make this clear for our viewers and those that are listening to us. All of the dogs that are trained to be service dogs for kids are trained by prisoners.
At this moment, yes.
Now, how do you train the prisoners?
Well, that was the real issue. And, you know, we had a little conversation before we sat down here in front of the cameras that really training animals is training people to train animals. And so I had been an animal trainer before, so I had trained people before, but they were pet owners that I had trained. I had not really spread the information about training a service dog and how that was different and so specific to anybody. So I thought probably it would be easier to have a bunch of people who didn't know anything than to have people. There you
ideas.
go. That was exactly it. And so we collected a bunch of people who knew nothing about training animals.
What, in working with prisoners, and then Eve, I'm going to ask you your take as a former judge going to
Right.
It
a
was an
prison
incredible thing,
and talking to prisoners, but what was your biggest surprise in working with prisoners, training them to train dogs?
In the beginning, honestly, I didn't care very much. I was looking to fulfill our need, which was having a place to have the animals trained in a room full of people who had to give them back, who didn't have much say about what their day was going to be like, who were very good about fulfilling our need because it was a highlight of their day, probably of their week and month and year, that they got to be with these animals all the time. And so they were very grateful, and I was not, honestly, so concerned about them. It was really over time and seeing their involvement, being part of this group of people that under other circumstances I would never have met, that the humanity shines through. I mean, I think when you deal with people, humanity shines through, and that's what happened.
Eve, after we come back from a short break, I'm going to ask you a little bit more, but what was your biggest surprise? You're a judge, right, on the 9th District, and yet you go into a prison and talk and meet with prisoners. So first, what was your biggest surprise in going and meeting the prisoners? And then we'll come back and hear the backstory. What was your biggest surprise?
Well, I think I was surprised at actually the layout of the prison itself and how would I say it, the sense of, as Wendy's saying, you know, there is a massive amount of humanity there and human potential that has been untapped. And I think it makes such a deep impression walking around and seeing it's like a village there, and just seeing all of the untapped potential and knowing that each and every person there has a particular story that got them to that place.
And we will hear in just a minute when we return.
Caitlin and Wilson are playing ball and she loves it. This is what we'll be doing for the next week. We love having Wilson. Look how happy it makes her look. Watch. Oh, you met. There it is. There it is. Oh, under your arm. Get it.
So Eve, tell us, I think for anyone going into a prison is an unusual experience, but here you are, an attorney, a judge, and now you are going into a prison with people that if you didn't particularly put them away, you could have put others away just like that.
Right.
So what was that like for you going into that scenario?
Well, on one level, I think it was probably not as unsettling or scary as it might have been for a person who had no interaction with people who have committed crimes. I had, prior to the Court of Appeals, I was on the trial court, so unfortunately I had to sentence many people, and I also had to do initial setting of bonds for felons who had committed serious crimes. So I was used to seeing people who had orange suits on and who, you know, and then interacting with them when it was time to sentence them. So on that level, I think it was probably a benefit for me to have had that experience because I knew that those who are in prison, they're just really just like anyone else, and they've made some very poor choices, and you know, that's why they're there. it's the consequence of those choices. So in that regard, it was not as uncomfortable as, again, it might have been.
Now, is it
for
unusual for a family to go to the prison and meet the people who are training the dogs? Was that unusual, or does that often happen?
It never happened until Nick Walczak got his dog.
So Nick,
that was our very first time, because when he got his dog, he had already turned 18, even though he applied before then. And that was the first time we were allowed to invite an actual recipient into the prison to meet his dog. So
let's talk about Nick for a moment. He is one of the students that was shot and survived the Chardon High School shooting.
Right.
He survived, but he survived to live in a wheelchair.
When I first met Nick, I met him soon after he had gotten out of the hospital. He was sitting in his chair in his mother's house, 18 years old, with a look on his face to me that said, I am stuck in this chair in my mother's house for the rest of my life. And I refer to him as seeming to me very small in his chair at that moment. And he received his dog.
And he went to the Correctional Institute and met the men who trained the dog.
And really assisted them in their being able to see how his body moved and see what he was physically able to do, rather than me just describing it for them. They got to work with him and really fine-tune this animal, so that since that time, Nick has a house of his own. He goes to Kent. He has a life. He has plans for his future. He is a grown man, very large in his chair. Very large.
Now, let me ask you I'm going to ask you for just one or two word answers. This is a privilege that prisoners earn to be able to?
Well, they apply, and they have to pass sort of criteria of no demerits. They call it something else in prison, but we'll use the term demerits. And we are a zero-tolerance organization. If somebody does something against the rules.
And how do you know? How do you know what happens?
Well, they always get caught.
Okay. They didn't learn that lesson.
The big crime,
they didn't
the big
learn
crime
that
in prisons,
yet.
there's only one. The crime's getting caught. And if they're going to do something against our rules and against our protocol, I always tell the guys, while you're doing that thing you're not supposed to be doing, you should probably be packing up your things at the same time, because we don't tolerate it.
Now, let me ask you this, because this will roll into Eve and her experience with the dog. I understand that every few weeks the prisoners exchange dogs. Is that?
Not every few weeks, but certainly during the course of their training, yeah, and for a purpose.
And they exchange dogs so that the dogs don't get too attached because they're going to move.
We want their first love to be their final love.
That's such a nice way to say that.
Yeah.
But now tell me, what is it like for both the prisoners when they have to say goodbye to the dog, and what is it like for the dog who then goes to a family in a whole different situation than the only one he really knows? So tell me what it's like for the prisoners to say goodbye, and tell me what it's like to then get this dog that was raised in a different situation.
It is as difficult a thing as you might imagine, being someone who loves their dog. It is as difficult a thing as it would be for you to, after a year, say, this dog has a bigger purpose than my heart.
And I always wanted to train a dog for the blind, and figured that, yes, it would be hard, but it may be the only good thing I do in my life.
It's grown men in tears. And you can't turn your eye away from the fact that these are human beings doing a service for a child and a family, that where else would they go? Where else would they turn?
They will never know.
Well, now they do.
Now they do.
No, because, yeah.
So tell me, you get this dog who's lived in a completely different situation and now joins your home. What was that first night or first week like?
Well, it was, and I'd like to echo what Wendy was saying first, is that because we were permitted to go to the prison and meet with the inmates who were working with Anchor, it was very moving, and to watch them say goodbye, I had to really work hard not to completely break down. I mean, it was really hard. So I was so moved by again, their connection to him and their love for him. Bringing him home was, for me, I was a little nervous, a little anxious, but this is such an easygoing, loving dog.
So you're more anxious bringing home the baby?
Yeah.
You gave birth to, or the dog?
The dog.
Okay.
For sure. Absolutely, 100%
funny.
sure about that. But he was so easygoing. So I was surprised at how actually easy it was, considering the fact that I had no experience, and he was leaving everything he knew. And so one would have expected him to be nervous or just unsettled, but he really wasn't. He was very comfortable.
Now, one thing that kind of interests me is that you have more than one child, and so how do you teach a dog to bond with more than one person so that they don't just bond with the person who they do the service acts for?
I think everybody in the household needs to know they're allowed to love the dog, that we place dogs into families for the benefit of a particular child who has challenges in his life. It would really be ridiculous for me to think that Sophia isn't going to love the
Right.
dog.
Right.
I mean, she's a lovely little girl. It's a beautiful dog. There he is, all cuddly
Right.
and warm. And I think our biggest mission in all this is teaching ways that are appropriate for others in the household to be in connection with the dog rather than thinking it's just a pet.
So, in the remaining minutes that we have, I'm going to ask for 1 or 2 word answers to really tough questions. So, what is an appropriate way to show love to a service dog in your home?
It's an appropriate way, physically rather than verbally. You want verbal things to be commands that are purposeful. So physical love, perfectly good way to do it.
What have you learned, Eve, in a word or two, is one of the biggest mistakes that families make with their service dogs?
Probably speaking to them as though they can understand. and my husband still hasn't grasped that dogs do not speak English.
Nor have I. Eve, when you are out in the public and someone sees Anchor and William, what do you want them to say or do, or what do you want them not to say or do in a sentence?
Well, if Anchor has his vest on, then he is not to be petted. And there are many people who don't know that Anchor is working. And so despite the fact that he's a beautiful dog and very friendly, it's just not appropriate to pet. So that's probably the number one thing that we have to enforce with people. And that's just how that has to go, so.
Now, W.A.G.S for Kids asks each family to host a fundraiser to pay it forward. Explain the philosophy and explain what that means to you, the philosophy of the organization, and then what that means to you as a family who's been a recipient of one of these dogs. So pay it forward.
When the phone rings and someone calls, a family calls and says, we need a dog for our child, very likely that's a dog we've already purchased, and we had a conversation about dogs are $1,800 or more sometimes. So the dog that family gets, when Anchor was going to be placed, that dog had already been purchased, had already been neutered, had already had all its shots. It had almost 2 years of training and professional training. It's not just the inmates who train. Our trainers go into the building. And so in order to keep that wheel turning, when Anchor leaves, we have to have the money to buy the next dog so that next year and in 5 years and 10 years, that phone will ring and a child in Northeast Ohio can have a dog.
And so the idea of paying it forward, tell us in a sentence or two what that means to you and your family.
Oh, I think it's a great way to operate the organization, because I think it's something that you naturally want to do. You want to give another child the joy that certainly William and the family, but in particular William, has experienced. William doesn't have friends and a social life and the way his peers have, and so to think about the idea that we can help another family have that privilege and that connection, that relationship is fantastic. So I wholeheartedly support that.
Tell us, are they all the same breed? Are they different breeds?
We deal with dogs basically the size of the height of a child's wheelchair, the arm of their wheelchair. So that is Golden Retrievers, Labrador Retrievers. We do doodles. My new favorite, Standard Poodles, have to tell you. I never expected it, but they're
Yale and Harvard
pretty, they're pretty
yes.
wonderful. And they all have square head, soft expression because they go out publicly. Many of them are in schools with children, not all of them. But we have to sort of bow to public perception of certain pointy-eared or pointy noses. And so we keep it pretty square and soft looking.
In a word or two, Eve, and my final question, tell me what's been the best thing about having your new four-legged family member?
Oh, the joy to William, without a doubt. It's
The
pure
joy to William.
Pure joy.
And you got to hear about it here today. Okay. Thank you for joining us on Forum 360 today with our guests, Anchor, our four-legged guest, Eve Belfance and Wendy Crann. For more information on today's topic, go to wagsforkids.org. Join us again. Thank you.
Forum 360 is brought to you with support from Electric Impulse Communications, Kim and Harvey Nelson, Rubber City Radio Group, Akronist.com, AkronBuzz.com, Medical Mutual of Ohio, Forum 360 supporters, and the Shaw Jewish Community Center of Akron.